Welcome to the Higher Love with Megan podcast with me, your host, Megan Cooper, a trauma-informed therapist, life coach and disruptor of wellness norms based in Brighton, UK. This isn't another nice-to-have wellness podcast. Instead, this podcast seeks to redefine what it means to be well in today's world. Here, we challenge the status quo, seek to reunite wellness with social justice and improve accessibility, diversity and inclusivity within wellness and beyond. As a listener, you are not here to passively consume. Instead, you are an ambassador for real, embodied, societal and systemic change in the world. As your host, I stand for radical self-inquiry and being able to have those confronting but necessary conversations so that we can remember our collective humanity at this time. We're here for the revolution and you've got a front row seat. Keri, it feels so good to have you finally back here. I was reflecting that we recorded our first episode together nearly 2 years ago, or just over 2 years ago, which I can't believe. Time has collapsed. It feels like yesterday, but also like an absolute decade ago. So welcome, Keri.
Cannot believe that has been 2 years. I'm so happy to be back.
We did our previous episode, Disrupting the Wellness Industry, which is one of my all-time favorite episodes. So please, listeners, go back and listen to that if you have not already. But if you are new to Keri's work, Keri Jarvis is a leftist coach, thought partner and community activist, supporting people to navigate the relational complexity of the polycrisis. Keri is deeply interested in how we've been relationally de-skilled and disciplined into seeing ourselves and one another as separate cogs in a machine within last stage capitalism. God, I'm used to saying late stage capitalism, but we're on to last stage capitalism.
I feel like we're in the last stage. I mean, I hope we are.
The end is hopefully the end is hopefully in sight. Her work supports people to develop more agile relationships with themselves, fertilizing the possibility of generative, resilient relational dynamics. She believes the portals to livable futures can be entered through our relationships, if only we can bear to be perceived. Beautiful. Keri, I know that these bios always kind of feel reductive of our humanity into a little paragraph. So I don't know if there was anything that you wanted to say to introduce yourself in a way that feels alive for you today on top of what I've already said.
Thank you so much. I suppose what feels relevant to share is that my coaching is really informed by all of the things that I am engaged with in my life, in my community, in the social justice endeavours I am connected to and participate in. I have some caution around sort of naming my work as coaching because ultimately it feels connected to neoliberal aims and norms, even just in that kind of title and the way that we're used to hearing it. So I'll throw that in there as well to say, there's a broadening of coaching that happens in the spaces that I share with people. And really my interest is at that intersection between individual, quote unquote, like self-development, even though I don't really believe in self-development. And so the intersection of that self-development and social justice.
Yes, it is incredibly hard, isn't it, to put these labels onto ourselves. I find it very difficult to label myself as a coach who's attempting to bring down like our mainstream coaching space, to be a wellness practitioner who doesn't agree with mainstream wellness, and to be someone that operates in the therapeutic space that disagrees with a lot of mainstream therapy. So yes, it is endlessly complex, isn't it? So moving on, I really wanted to start us off with a quote from one of your recent essays on your blog entitled Refusing Estrangement, Reclaiming Relation. And you write, week in, week out, my coaching conversations return to one core paradox. We are so desperate to be known and we avoid intimacy as often as we can. Know me, parts of us implore. Stop fucking noticing things about me, other parts demand. Do not see my needs but meet them activism. Do not perceive that I am unusually passionate about this topic, but honor and be instantly persuaded by my perspective. Do not sniff out my self-doubt, but reassure me. Have basically no clue who I am, but imbue me with a sense of belonging. These are the ways that we have learned to survive psychologically, socially, emotionally in a hostile capitalist society.
I just want to include myself in this kind of dynamic. This is not to say that I am sitting on some mountain looking down, observing everyone else playing these games. This is certainly still something that I am trying to practice my way out of in my daily life. I think that the fear of being perceived has been almost like memeified, like we speak it to one another in a sort of sarcastic, ironic way, and yet also it remains a kind of deeply like worrying prospect for many of us across various contexts. And there are so many reasons for that. And some of those reasons are personal, and some of those reasons are like shared and systemic and may depend upon our positionality within the systems that we live in. But ultimately, the more I reflect, the more I notice the very best moments of my own life, and what I notice in sort of the stories that clients tell me and the conversations that I have with my friends. I think the very best moments of our lives emerge from some kind of relationality, some kind of intimacy, and that at the same time, we find it so frightening. There is a way in which we are kind of like prohibited from accessing that joy and that sort of steadiness that we can find in one another. So it's like this dance where we, on the one hand, like we yearn for and we crave one another. And at the same time, we're terrified of one another, in part because of our fear that we might be rejected, misunderstood. Of course, in all of this, I'm holding the fact that some relationships are dangerous and some relationships contain violence and abuse. And that's not what I'm talking about here when I talk about like our sort of fear of one another. I'm talking about largely healthy relationships with people who we care about and are known and beloved to us, and how we still find ourselves hiding and turning our backs on one another because it feels too overwhelming to risk being known.
When you were talking, I was really just feeling into how strong that desire is to be fully seen, fully heard, fully met for all that we are, and yet how terrifying it is. We deeply want to be accepted for our messiness and for our flaws and for all of the things, quote unquote, wrong with us. But at the same time, how we just don't want to show those parts of us because society has taught us that those are unacceptable, that we need to fit ourselves into nice, neat little boxes, perfectionism that comes from colonialism and the supremacist structures behind our lives, that this is how we behave, this is how we present ourselves, and how intolerant we then become of that within ourselves and also within other people. I would love for you to share in what other ways do you perceive that the systems of capitalism, supremacy, patriarchy behind our lives have informed the ways that we interact with one another and in many respects de-skilled us.
One book that I would really recommend for anyone who is interested in this is Radical Intimacy by Sophie K. Rosa. She does a great job chapter by chapter exploring various ways that this happens. But to give some different examples, so I was speaking with someone at our community care bank this week, and he was talking about his housing situation and how they're a family of 4 with 2 children of big age gap and different genders who are all living in a 1-bedroom flat. And we were talking about his housing situation. I was mulling over what is the context within which this is allowed to happen. On the same day that I was speaking with him about that, I was reading something from an online contact about how she lives in a collective housing situation. And that was reminding me, I think it's in that book of Sophie K. Rosa, she talks about how like in parts of America, it's literally illegal to have more than, I think, 3 people who are not related by blood or marriage buying or renting a house together. Like it's literally like regulated out the possibility that you could share your living costs with people that you are not either like contractually connected to through marriage or connected to by blood. And that's a like highly visible, extreme expression of the state's power. But there are other more implied ways that that shows up. So, you know, how is it that we come to notice that we will be seen as strange if we are deeply interested in the lives of people who don't sit within these categories of like nuclear family or like best friends? Like, to what extent are we allowed to get involved with other people? In one of my favorite books, Lola Olufemi's Experiments in Imagining Otherwise, she talks about bonds being more powerful than rights, bonds signaling a mutual commitment to remain involved with one another beyond the narrowly defined limits of the law. And I think about that all the time. Like, how can we notice where having laws in place, we imagine, and by we, I'm speaking for me and people like me, especially like middle-class white people, we imagine that we are therefore like off the hook. You know, there's a way in which it's sort of the law becomes like an intervention to relation. So a few weeks ago, I know I talked to you about this privately, Megan, like I witnessed this awful episode of brutal domestic violence on my street. And there is this sense when we are around domestic violence that like the solution, the route to resolving this is to involve the police and social services. I'm not saying those are the wrong things to do, but I also don't think that they are necessarily the whole of the solution, and that moving towards our neighbours and offering what we can in terms of relational, not safety, because we can't guarantee that, but like a soft relational landing space or resources or whatever it might be, I think forms another important part of the solution. So just a couple of examples there of state intervention in the possibilities for relationship, like some of it very explicit and prohibitive, like it's illegal to do that. And some of it, which is more like, oh, don't worry, we'll take care of it. Like, you stay in your little boxes of your little houses with your nuclear family and don't become involved in one another's lives.
Wow, I had no idea. I mean, I'm not surprised ever, I feel, anymore. Shocked, endlessly shocked, but never surprised that that would be legislated in the States, and ways that we sever our ability to be in community together, and how in some ways it would take so much pressure off, in quote unquote, the system if we were more community minded, but then how threatening that is to centralized power in so many ways, and how we see that in our communities and in our societies. I mean, the fact that especially in big cities, it's not uncommon for people to not know their neighbours, or on the bus, on the tube, how we sit there in silence. And I've heard you talk about how beautiful it is that we have these moments when we're sat in a public space, whether it be the train or something, and people start singing together, but how strange it is in a way that that is not commonplace, how different our lives might be if our interactions on the daily were to change. I'd love to just build on what you've said by talking about ways in which you perceive our wellness culture or Western psychology to perhaps perpetuate some of these relational challenges.
I feel like maybe the first wellness mantra that started to crumble for me was the what other people think of you is none of your business. Just a tiny bit of context that I've been running my own business since I had my first child in 2013. I used to be a hypnobirthing teacher. Then I moved into coaching other birth workers, and I've been around the girl boss block, harder to say than I thought, a few times. And at that time, I had like 2 very young children. I was postnatally depressed. I was really in a space of feeling a loss of self, feeling a severance from self, from any sort of sense of who I am, but also like what I thought my life was going to look like, any access to some form of success inside the systems and whatnot. So at that time, finding myself in an online climate where I was being told, oh, you women who feel that you have been forgotten and you are unseen, here is a place where you can actually be sort of elevated. you're meant for more than this. Meant for more is another one that really sort of like puts me on edge, because it's like meant for more than whom. And so we go far enough to sort of recognize that this is not good enough, but we'll sort of single out the people who are worthy of something more than this. Anyway, back to my original point. In that context at the time, there was really this shift towards hyper independence, a complete disregard for feedback, a sense that everyone who criticizes you is just jealous of you. Like, this was all tied up in this, what other people think of you is none of your business. And of course, like, being met with that permission to define yourself and to protect yourself from critique when you feel so vulnerable, you feel like you're in that sort of like lobster shedding its shell sort of stage. Of course, that's deeply appealing. And I used to really like that. I remember a time when I was like, okay, great. Like, I don't have to attach to this. I don't have to care about it. And on reflection over time, that was really damaging to my relationships. It was certainly damaging to my marriage. And over time, I guess as I sort of matured over the years and became more engaged with social justice, and also got some better coach training from Sass Pederick, shout out to Sass Pederick. I believe she's got some more coach training coming back this year after many years of not offering any, so I would recommend. Really sort of coming to this perspective of what other people think of me is filtered through the lens of their experience, and I am free to use my discernment to decide what I would like to do with what other people think of me. Rather than like, what other people think of me is who I am, or what other people think of me is none of my business. It's like, no, we are relational beings. And at some point, no matter how much we affirm that we do not give a shit what people think of us, that is simply not true. As we are living, breathing humans, like, as long as that is true, there will be a part of us that has some concern for how the group perceives us. So there's also that like erosion of self-trust that's occurring there as well, where we're having a certain bodily experience, but we're affirming like, I don't care.
Totally. And there's also another side of that I hear around accountability and responsibility. Because if you've got multiple people saying the same thing to you, there might also be something there for you to look at. And especially for those of us that probably need to do a little bit more of our conditional unlearning, by which I mean, you know, for myself, for you, humans in white bodies, living in a white supremacist culture, who could very easily fall into a trap of white feminism. When we're running our businesses and holding spaces, there might well be feedback that's actually really necessary in order for us to hold constructive spaces where more people feel like they are welcome and belong. So if we're holding this very binary or reductive or fortified space of, well, what other people think is none of my business, then we're also denying ourselves the chance to evolve, but also denying our spaces the chance to be like in constructive community as well. So I hear that other side to it too.
Yeah, 100%. And there's like, obviously there's a power dynamic at play there as well. So what happens when there's one leader saying what everyone thinks of me is none of my business, and there's a group of people with concern? But also, what happens in a relationship? What if both people are saying what you think of me is none of my business? I mean, what kind of way to move through life is that? So it feels like it was really a time of like great reductionism. Everything was about these like sound bites, you know, like that sound bite culture of like chucking these pithy phrases at one another because we don't know how to communicate. So you had this sort of industry of coaches telling people, oh, just say this, with no actual integration of what it means to embody a degree of detachment from other people's opinions and openness to our impact on others and hearing about that.
It also makes me think of boundaries, which I'd really like to bring up with you, because boundaries are, you know, and a disclaimer, boundaries are necessary. Boundaries are necessary, especially in relationships, which involves violence, harm, and a genuine need to assert our space within a relational dynamics. They can also be very supportive for, you know, us if we have always overgiven without nurturing ourselves. So there's also an importance, in saying no, in knowing what our yes feels like. There is 100% an importance of boundaries. But I suppose within, our mainstream wellness culture and Western psychology, there has become very much this focus on boundaries that can really act as walls around us to not allow that relational dynamic. So I'd love for you to speak to that, please.
I suppose one of the first things I would love to say about boundaries is like in full agreement with everything you're saying, again, I'm speaking in terms of healthy enough relational dynamics, but there's something about like the fetishization of the individual and the way in which a neoliberal wellness culture, there's a delusion that the self is contained in the individual body and the individual kind of day-to-day life. So I'm really interested in Davy Hildyard's The Second Body concept, which broadly just considering, there's this quote of hers like, I'm here sitting in my body in this room, but in a very real way, I'm in the sky causing storms, or I'm kind of like washing up on a beach in the global south with like my pollution. I'm massively butchering what she says here, but like that's kind of sense of what she's getting at, that the self, like who is Keri Jarvis? Like we were at the beginning, like, oh, who are you? Like, what do you want to say about yourself? Well, some things I could say about myself are that this morning I've been using a phone with a battery that was maybe mined by enslaved children. Like that's actually part of who I am, quote unquote. These shorts I'm wearing are very old. I can't remember where they're from. Like who knows whether they were made in any sort of ethical conditions. And there are all these components of the self that we seek to ignore and deny. And that might not seem connected to boundaries, but for me, it very much is, because it's sort of paired with that feeling of like, oh, this is what I'm available for. But it completely denies, like, I'm actually also available for child enslavement. Like, we're not ready to be honest with ourselves about where we end and sort of the rest of the world begins. So this notion of like how much we're allowed to know and be in relationship with one another becomes very complex, and we might find ourselves hiding at either end of this spectrum. Sort of rather than be in that messy middle together, where say like you and I might have a conversation about what does it mean that I am willing to use this phone? And where does guilt come into this? And what responsibilities do I have? And like, how does one move through the world in this positionality? Like, we might have a conversation about that in real depth and swim in that complexity. But instead, in a lot of our relationships, we might move to either, I'm not willing to discuss any of this. Like, I'm protecting my energy. I'm protecting my well-being. I need a cleaner space. I'm doing energetic hygiene. That's another one that I remember. And therefore, you cannot know me at all. I'm going to hold you at like a complete distance. Or another version of that is I am completely boundaryless, and you can tell me exactly what to do, and I will just accept your opinions as fact, and I will go along with everything that you want, which is another way to refuse to be known. And again, like coming kind of full circle back to the beginning, it's that like, know me, but don't. Like, we so desperately want to be in that middle area together where we can admit our complicity and we can go through the whole range of emotions connected to that. And at the same time, we're frightened to death that we will become unlovable in that space. And so we retreat either to like, I don't want to talk about it, or, I'll let you tell me I'm a piece of shit, basically.
It really makes me reflect existing in these grey areas, how challenging it is for us as humans to exist in that place of the unknown, because so many of us are terrified of the unknown, and we spend our lives running away from it and trying to create as much structure in our lives as possible, and then wondering why we're so anxious all of the time. But how challenging it is for us in a place of relation to be in grey areas. I've brought up topics before where I've been like, I need an answer on like how to move forward from this place in this relationship. And, you've reflected things back to me of like, what is it that makes you feel like you need a concrete answer to this right now? And I'm not denying that sometimes that is what we need, but also there is sometimes a need to exist in that grey area, to blur the lines of our boundaries or our expectations or what we want from something. And when you were talking, I was really feeling into, again, how we repeat that binary nature. I'm in or I'm out. You can talk to me or you can't talk to me. This is my boundary and this is not. And how we tend to exist in our relational dynamics in those two spaces. But what you're speaking to here is our ability to like merge those lines, not in a place of diffusing our boundaries, but actually coming into this place of care, relational intimacy and movability and growth essentially within that space in between. And another example that comes up a lot is the times through which we're living and the very real challenges of our reality. Genocide, ecocide, emboldening racism, the global struggles that we witness. For those of us that are invested and feel deeply connected to those challenges, and for those also who are impacted by them every single day, we've had conversations of how do we exist in spaces with people who either disagree with us or people who are not interested, not passionate, not on the same page about that, and how easy it is and, sometimes necessary, but how do we exist in these spaces as communities when we have people who are not interested in speaking up about genocide in Gaza, who are voting reform or voting restore, when that feels so impenetrable for us to be in relation together? What do you have to say there?
Well, I believe that it is actually the work for those of us with, again, like my positionality, like middle class whiteness. I believe it is my responsibility to take the steps that can move us. I don't mean me, the hero, the savior. I can move things. I mean, with hundreds of thousands of us willing to take these steps, we might move things. And I suppose like a way that it feels clearer to me is like, how is anything ever going to shift for the better in our social fabric if it does not include people with our degree of security, stability, and privilege, finding the patience and the resolve and the capacity to practice inviting people to reconsider the kind of right-wing indoctrination that many people who we will be connected to, perhaps loosely and perhaps intimately in our lives, have experienced over the past few years. Because it occurs to me that when we engage in activism, so much of what we do is quite visible and quite public. You and I have met up on many Palestine solidarity protests. I really value the opportunity to be on those protests and to dance in the streets while people are drumming and to move our bodies and to make artistic signs and to dress colourfully and to drink watermelon flavoured frozen drinks, and all of that I value for my own personal benefit, to be honest, right, in terms of like sustaining me, keeping me going, giving me access to a sense of humanity in others. And I value it for the reason that it's a visible demonstration to other people that it is normal and acceptable and right to care about this stuff. So I don't mean to diminish the value of our more visible public engagement with forms of activism like that. At the same time, I notice that the way in which the media comes in and entirely misrepresents what these protests are, tells people who are not yet on board with like an anti-genocide mentality that these protests are actually something completely different, and that they're really inconveniencing you and they're really costing you loads of money. And I know that you yourself were like personally attacked by a quote unquote journalist who was making a lot of assumptions about the people who are engaged in this kind of protest activity. So there's a smear campaign around protesting. Never mind the smear campaign around direct action, which is not just a smear campaign, but is like a, authoritarian state clampdown that should terrify us all. But in terms of what is going to be effective, I actually believe, particularly for someone like me with a chronic illness, my long COVID really limits my capacity to like travel and to be out much. But I really believe that the most effective thing I can do is spend time in respectful conversation with people whose views I don't agree with. And that doesn't mean that I'm doing that all the time. And that doesn't mean that I'm doing that really well all the time. But it does mean that I think about it often, that I am constantly sort of assessing my effectiveness and seeking to develop my strategies around that. George Monbiot published an article in The Guardian about this deep canvassing idea, and this group in Devon who are doing a really good job with that is one example of how we can, when we offer people a listening space where they genuinely feel like they are being heard, they are much more likely to be available for moving their position a bit. Now, what also needs to happen, and I know that people are going to have like a real reaction to this, that where they're not going to like it, we also have to be willing to be changed by the conversation. And often the big barrier to the other person moving towards us is that they can tell through the words that we are saying or energetically that there is no movement in us whatsoever. Now, I'm not talking about I move from a opposed to genocide to, oh, maybe it's not that bad, obviously. But I am talking about I am opposed to genocide and I perceive you in this way. I perceive you and your apathy or, you know, whatever story I've got going on and being willing to see the person in front of us slightly differently. And it brings to mind that Octavia Butler quote from Parable of the Sower, which everyone should be reading right now if you are brave enough. All that you touch, you change. All that you change, changes you. And it's when we put up this barrier, again, like a boundary, I am actually correct, and so I will not be moving, that we immediately rule out the possibility of the other person moving towards us, because to do so would be to lose if they are the conditions of the game.
Side note, I have so much respect for your ability to quote people. Like, I feel like my podcast is me just like bastardizing people's quotes, but your ability to actually pluck these things out of your mind is just wonderful to witness. So thank you for that, modeling that so beautifully. But an example was coming into my head whilst you were speaking. About a year ago, we did a public installation putting out children's shoes, representing the tens of thousands of children who have been killed during the genocide in Gaza over the past 3 years. And a man came up, I was literally putting children's shoes out, and he said, well, this is a bit one-sided, isn't it? And I was like, in what kind of way? And he said, well, what about the children of Israel? And I was like, okay, immediately triggered, because obviously seeing that many shoes is very impactful. And I was like, I can't handle this. Like, I'm not dealing with this at this time. And a friend of mine came over and she approached him calmly, you know, could you say more about what you think? And he said, well, you know, I think X, Y, Z, this is where I get my information. And she said, well, it's interesting because I get my information from here and this is what I've heard and blah, blah. And they had this back and forth. And by the end of the conversation, he said, well, maybe I do need to expand the sources of what I'm reading. And maybe, you know, maybe I have been incorrect about X, Y, Z. And I was watching this like it was a game of tennis, just like, wow, this is amazing for me to witness, because her ability to come calmly with facts, coming into the conversation in the way that she did was impactful. I don't know what you think to this, but the story that I told myself about that interaction is, you know, maybe we all have slightly different personalities and tolerances and capacities, and all have a different role in the kind of ecosystem of relational change. So, for example, like I like making videos of me shouting on the internet. Not everyone enjoys doing that. So maybe that's what I have to contribute to the collective space. But in those scenarios of speaking to somebody in public, I have less tolerance for that. So that's the story that I told myself, that maybe that's not my role, but that could also be a way that I am letting myself off the hook. So what do we think, Keri?
I mean, I do agree with you that we all have different skill sets and different roles, and it's not just fine, but it's like essential that we are all allowed to fulfill our potential, you know, in that sense, that we're not forced to sort of be shoehorned into a role that costs us more than we can generate. I do also know from some of our previous conversations that you are very, very good, very skilled, very willing, very committed to having tricky conversations with people who you do know. So it might be that the stranger piece is not really for you, but that actually people who are known to you, you are much more able to do that, which for some people, strangers, okay, people who are known to me, much more challenging. So there's that component as well. But to go to what are kind of the qualities or characteristics that we might need, I would name it as a capacity for complexity and uncertainty. You mentioned earlier, like our sort of inbuilt intolerance for uncertainty, and it is a psychological risk, as is complexity. Like, I find myself adrift. I'm not sure how this is all going to settle, and I'm not sure what sort of exposure I am going to have here. So that part of us that only cares about our psychological safety is going to seek to resolve all of that. And if we cannot lean into a sort of healthy adult self, zoomed out perspective, then we are going to struggle. And doing that requires that piece that you mentioned right at the top, like an agile relationship with the self. And what I mean by that is, in that interaction with a stranger, say, we need to feel that we can have that conversation without experiencing what I might loosely and jovially call a psychological death. And by that, I mean, if I am deeply attached to the notions that I am competent, intelligent, well-informed, persuasive, likable, like any of these things, all or none, like any of those characteristics might be present for each of us. If I'm deeply attached to my sense, like I am this way, myself in a situation where it's going to be revealed and highlighted that I cannot live up to that, then that opens up this capacity for like shame spiral, real like psychological distress, because it's like, oh, being that way keeps me safe in the world. Being that way means that people like me, or I am employable, or I am respected, whatever it might be. And so if that is exposed, if I lose my temper, or if the other person gets the better of me, then I might lose positionality, I might lose status, lose security. If we can come into any of our engagements with others with a different relationship to the self, where it's not like I am these things, but it's like, these are the characteristics I aspire to embody. I value being friendly. I value being informed. I value being persuasive, whichever ones we feel most attached to. I value my sort of sense of competence, and I kind of commit to like rigorously informing myself. And still, I understand that I will not be able to live up to these things all the time, and that any of my behaviors do not define who I am now and who I have the capacity to become moving forwards, and I am worthy of love and belonging throughout. So if you could just make that quick switch, everyone, then everything's going to be fine. The world won't end. It's all good.
Absolutely. And I think, something that I remember you saying to me ages ago during a time of relational complexity, and you were kind of saying along the lines of, in 6 months, in a year, in 10 years, how would you like to look back on this moment in the way that you held and navigated yourself? And that's really something that I try to really hold in my relational dynamics now. Can I look back on that? And even if it didn't turn out in the way that I wanted it to, even if the conversation, quote unquote, didn't go the way that I wanted it to, can I look back at who I was aspiring to be in that moment, i.e. somebody who handles their relationships or relational dynamics with care, with understanding, with compassion? Then that for me is kind of like my new version of like, quote unquote, success,
Yes.
And it takes me to another example of the Carnival Against Fascism in Brighton that happened last month. And for those that have followed me, you might have seen my videos of how there was actually a lot of police brutality during that time with a far right march that was wanting to come through the town. Brighton residents refused to allow a far right march through the town and block the way. And this was met with the police using batons and pepper spray on Brighton residents. And after being pepper sprayed, I had 2 interactions with police officers, which were not positive interactions. There is then a video of me shouting at a police officer. And I watched it back and I'm like, this doesn't feel good for me, And I understand, and the compassion within myself too is that was a very heightened experience. I was angry. We have a right to be angry during the situation, and the circumstances allow for that. I've also, discussed it with friends of colour, for example, who are like, I've only ever been shown animosity by the police, so don't extend too much towards them type thing. So I understand that there is also an intersectional element to this. But when I've watched it, I'm like, in that interaction, if it were to happen again, I would like to be able to diffuse the situation by, I guess, remaining in a place of connected to my sense of care in that moment. Even if it is not quote unquote justified within that situation, it feels like something that I would want to aspire to be within that situation.
In all of what I'm saying, I would love to be really clear with anyone who doesn't know me and is hearing me speak about these things as the first encounter with me. I'm not here to tell anyone that your anger is unjustified, or so very much like in this work with people, it's around self-compassion as much as it is compassion for others. Because, this is entangled. Compassion for self is essential if we want to have compassion for others. And it emerges from that same sense making of like, behaviors make sense in context. So certainly, there might be friends of mine listening to this being like, well, I remember when we stood outside our MP's office and that person said that thing and you chased them down the street screaming at them. And yeah, like on a bad day, that's what you're going to find me doing. And sometimes it's like, it's just
on a good day.
Yeah, on a good day. It's just got to come out. Sometimes it's just got to come out. And someone is going to encounter us like wrong place, wrong time. And that's just going to be how it is. And I think about that as well in the context of my own development to this point too, because certainly like 2019, 2020, I was like shaming people all over the internet for fun. Like that was my like era of like, you are bad, you are a fraud, I do not respect you. Like, really triggered by my own realizations about my own complicity, coming to terms with that, projecting it out onto other people in a way that, did make sense and was accurate, but was entirely unhelpful. And still, I've often said this, like, I don't regret that. I don't regret that at all. Because actually, I think it is a necessary part of the path to graduate like beyond it. I think we have to move through a phase of like extreme outrage and expressing that in ways that feel really like primal and visceral, so that can move through us, and then we can move towards something that is maybe more generative for the sake of the whole.
Yeah, totally. It's interesting. I was actually reflecting a couple of days ago about, how I went from my kind of like corporate version of me in my corporate job into my love and light era, and actually how important that was in order to take me out of one stage of my life. Like I needed to go into a completely different state in order to then emerge to where I'm at, which is a kind of combination of the two. But how important it is for us to allow ourselves to go through processes and be compassionate with ourselves. Because also, in regards to the way that we communicate and our relational dynamics with each other, what you're speaking to is how these systems have like de-skilled us for so long, and intergenerationally and collectively, how we're all so de-skilled in so many of these things, and how terrifying that can be actually when we start to have conversations with more grey areas and more uncertainty, how difficult that can be. And as you were speaking about the death of self, how can I go into this situation and allow myself to not be right, for example? There's so much there. And it's like a total recalibration of our nervous systems, our brain, our mind, the whole interrelationship of that. I know that when I started to actually speak about the stuff, how difficult that was for my nervous system and like the psychosomatic responses that I would have to that. So this is a very long roundabout way of saying actually how important it is for us to be compassionate with ourselves in these processes and to practice this stuff too. So like a friend said to me, to bring in the example of the police officer, for example, she was like, I love the video. I think it's great. So I think that's a win. However, I understand that from your perspective, you might not want to do that again. And probably if and when, unfortunately, you have to be in that situation again, you might respond differently. And what I'm taking from that too is all of these interactions, and to bring in, the interaction with the stranger, at the installation, I might respond differently again because I've had that experience, and it's like an invitation to do something differently.
100%. And this is the self-compassion, isn't it? We cannot get it right first time. Like, where are our elders? Like, as white people, especially those of us who sort of perceive ourselves as being like British and perhaps of a lot of like British descent, we are so deeply disconnected from our working class ancestors and any sense of what it means to move in solidarity together, and any sense of that sort of real lineage of wisdom and support. There's no training manual here for us, and we need to look to peoples who have been resisting for much longer than we have, and who are much more at risk. And that's not going to happen overnight. We're not going to be able to integrate that immediately. And I really just want to pick up on something that you said about just considering our interactions with the police, because many of us have been raised to deeply respect the police. And in our whiteness, you and I, it's probably been quite okay to feel okay about the police, and to imagine that if we found ourselves in trouble, that we might approach a policeman, and that most times that would work out okay. But breaking out of that relational agreement with the police and breaking out of what is expected of you as like a good white woman, it kind of illuminates how there are certain sets of behaviors and forms of emotional expression that are expected of people in different positions. So, your anger is not expected, but it's not going to be responded to with the same aggression as like a black woman's anger. But also it leaves me asking, like, what forms of emotional expression are unavailable to men? And I know that a lot of the difficult conversations that people who I work with are dealing with are with the men in their lives. And I had just this deep sense that if men were able to express their fear and their sorrow and their disappointment and their humiliation and their shame, some sort of relational safety, that would of course be transformative. I know you've had many men on the show kind of expressing similar sentiments.
100%. And just one more thing just to say on that example of the policeman, side note, many of my friends have pointed out that actually probably if I was a woman of colour, or if I was a man in that situation shouting at the police, probably would have been arrested. So actually, as a white woman, using my unearned privilege of my identity, I'm probably the perfect person in that situation to shout at the police for pepper spraying residents. So we'll just leave that one there. Anyway, I just wanted to speak to, you mentioned something there about, communities who have learned care as a way of survival. And, it really rung a bell for me of sense of community care versus self-care, because within our modern wellness culture, we've all got very into self-care. But actually what you're speaking to of community care, the way that we take care of each other. And I really wanted to bring in this thing that's really been percolating with me recently. A friend of mine, Zaira, who is an art psychotherapist and a community care champion, she was speaking to me about, how important it is for us to develop these skills to take care of each other and to really look at the ways that we speak to each other and perpetuate harm within activist spaces, within spaces of social change. How if we are not taking care of the way that we treat each other, the way that we speak to each other, we can so easily fall into this place of othering each other. And it also really landed for me. There's a creator who I really love, a musician called Andre Henry. who focuses on fighting despair in this world built to break us. He was talking about how in the absence of relational skills, we continue again to other each other and perpetuate harm. And I was just wondering if there was anything that you wanted to add to that of how necessary this work is within social change.
What's coming up for me as you're speaking is Audre Lorde, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house.
Yeah.
Like, we have to be willing to practice together. I think our kind of spaces of activism and community care ought to be, I was going to say first and foremost, I don't know who I think I am telling people what their spaces should be, but I have this sense that one of the big opportunities is to use these spaces as rehearsal spaces for the dynamics of livable futures, and to ask ourselves, like, if this future that we want was here, what would this conversation look like? If everyone here was like not worried about housing, not worried about paying their bills, if everyone here knew that they could walk down the street with a sense of safety, if everyone here in the room had like access to joy in their lives and could do the kind of work that would bring them satisfaction, if we were all surrounded by lovely trees all the time instead of like tarmac, like to use that as an imaginative way to conjure up these little slithers of that future that we want, and to express them together in those relational dynamics. And I suppose, like, in a more practical sense, I think the missing piece a lot of the time, and I'm basing this on conversations with clients, is the struggle to name what is in the room, the struggle to name what is being felt, which again takes us full circle back to the beginning. I would like you to notice I'm struggling with what's going on here, but I am unwilling to share that with you. So ultimately then we both have to start making up stories about what's happening because we're not willing to talk about it. And, you know, like really sort of bringing it down to like really simple examples of the ways in which that happens. Someone might think, oh, I haven't been given a task. I haven't been given a responsibility. I must not be trustworthy. I must not be respected in the group. And actually, it could just be like, oh, I mentioned to someone earlier that like my child is unwell, or I've not been doing very well with my health recently. And they're coming from a compassionate place of like not wanting to overload me. But maybe we all feel awkward about how to say these things. So this space opens up between us relationally where all these other stories can come in. And often we don't even notice that that has happened. And like a few weeks have passed and suddenly we're just convinced that we all dislike each other and we are not really sure how this started. So really being willing to think about like, how do we practice telling one another the truth about what is here in the room in the way that we would in a society with a safety net, in a society where there was actual belonging and not the sort of hostility of last stage capitalism.
Leading back to that, what qualities or skills do we need to develop for enhancing our relational dynamics with each other? The word that comes up for me there is courage as well, because, you know, whether that is courage to say the thing that we need or the courage to ask each other, to say the thing, to do the thing, that does actually require a sense of bravery, because again, we're going into that gray area, right? Of like, I don't know what you're going to say. I don't know how I'm going to be received. I don't know what complexity this can bring in. And there's this sense of developing bravery and courage as well within our communication, because again, it's like I don't know if I'm going to be rejected, or I don't know how I'm going to be able to hold that within you. We're all so afraid of doing the wrong thing, saying the wrong thing, that, you know, when somebody is really going through a difficult time, discomfort, grief, we're so incapable of holding that within each other as well.
I would also really direct anyone struggling with that in activist spaces to Dean Spade's work and his Love in a Fucked Up World body of work, because there's a lot of like specifics there. That's got to be another podcast guest very soon, Megan.
Somebody else recommended that book to me literally last weekend. So I feel like this is like, okay, just one more question for you. Just side note too. Spending time with Keri is just like an endless book list. Like, I feel like there are not enough years that I have on this planet to read all of the books. That you seem to have an insane capacity to read. It's again something that I admire within you. So many books, so little time, but that's also late stage capitalism, so little time. So all the time in the world to read all of the wonderful books. Anyway, I will put all of them in the show notes. But just coming on to reimagining possibility, reimagining ways that we can be together. You mentioned it, that some of your highlights, your glimmers have come from moments of being in relation with each other. And when I come to think of it, there so many of my kind of favorite moments of interaction have also come from strangers. There's one example that really sticks out for me, and I'm sure that listeners also have their examples too. In my mid-20s, I was going through a really difficult breakup. I was so heartbroken. I'd held my shit together all day at work, putting on a brave face. And then I got onto the tube and sat down and like burst into tears. And I mean, like, not like little tears. I mean, like absolute hysterics, which is obviously like a lot on like a contained underground. And a lot of people are quite distressed by the situation. But the girl next to me was quite quiet. And then she just said, you know, what's going on for you? Like, are you okay? And I like poured out my heart to her. And she just took my hand and then she just said, men are shit. And we just held hands for literally like the rest of the tube journey. And I'm not going to go into that, oh, we shouldn't say men are shit. But in that moment, I just needed a fellow girl in her mid-20s to just say men are shit, and for me just to sit there and cry holding her hand. And it was so beautiful because we didn't really need anything else. But these touching, fleeting moments of interaction that we are very capable of doing for each other, where we don't need, you know, to say or do the right thing. We just need to be there in these moments. And I know that everyone else has those moments probably in their mind that they're feeling into right now. But the reason why I say this is that it's very within our reach in many respects to create the type of environments that we want to be in day to day. And so just as a bit of a precursor of how can you reimagine possibility in ways of us being together in relation?
I'm really glad that you've brought us back to strangers, because certainly, that was missed at the beginning when I was speaking about the sort of the highest highs emerging from deep intimacy with beloved people, you know, seeing like a child who you love, like laughing their head off, or seeing an elderly person who you've been in a deep relationship with for a long time, like sharing something with you from their lives when they were younger and telling you a story, like, you know, there's all that kind of stuff. But certainly you're absolutely right. I have my own memories of very short, very random interactions with strangers that have given me that like warm feeling in my chest, that kind of, well, I might even like float off the ground feeling, you know, just a sort of that sense of aliveness, like flowing through us. And I certainly think that engagement with strangers, and perhaps easiest to begin with our neighbours, or perhaps most challenging to begin with our neighbours, depending on how we look at it. But I do think that there is untold potential in those places. And I know that not everyone wants to spend all their time out and about in the world talking to people. I have 2 children. I very much understand that sometimes I just need to be left alone with my own thoughts, or to go and listen to my podcast in peace or whatever. But I think I'm really interested in this concept of radical engagement. So that's Adam Kahane, whose work, I'm very into his book at the moment, Collaborating with the Enemy. But he has this other piece of work, Radical Engagement. I'm sorry about this, Megan, or this book. And that phrase has really stayed with me. Like, what does it mean to be radically engaged with life? What does that mean? And it doesn't mean stopping for an in-depth conversation with every single stranger, but it does mean a sort of posture of openness, I think, where when there is that sense of the potential for an interaction, rather than the first instinct being to shy away and shut it down, that we might sort of like dwell for a second longer and risk the possibility that someone might begin to speak with us, or that we might give a stranger a compliment, or even that we might get into a different depth of relationship with our more than human kin, that like when we're out for a walk, maybe we will stop and really commune with a tree. Or like yesterday I was watching a bee having a little nap on a flower in the park and just thinking like, oh, we're just hanging out for a second. Like, I wonder how the rest of your day has been. You know, so really paying attention to the fact that we are part of this vast ecology of life, and that there are all these ways in which we are sort of plugged into that. that we, back to some of my earlier points, sort of like relentlessly seek to deny, relentlessly seek to isolate ourselves as we conform with these neoliberal norms, and instead to be like, no, I am going to radically engage. I'm going to touch back into all these points where life is.
I love that. I love that. And I love how they are like magical moments, those being like radically engaged. And I think that there's something there for me about like slowing down as well. Like in our, in the world in which we live, it's so fast paced. Everyone has got so many hats that they're wearing, so many responsibilities. We're always rushing. And when we're able to just like slow down for a second, sometimes these moments feel available. It just comes to mind the other morning, and I'd totally forgotten. I was walking somewhere early in the morning, and there was a council worker who was picking up litter from the ground. First thing in the morning, nobody else on the streets. And he was there kind of like humming to himself. And I walked past him, and then I just paused and I went back to him and I just said, I just want to say, because I live in Brighton, it's a shit show during summer. The whole world is here to enjoy the beach and leaves litter all over the place. And I said, I just want to say thank you so much for keeping the streets so clean during this time, because I imagine that it's very hot in this heat. And I imagine that there is a lot of litter that you've been picking up all morning. So thank you for the work that you were doing. And he was like, thank you so much. Like, have a lovely day. I was like, that feels like a nice interaction for me. Hopefully it felt like a nice interaction for him. And that literally took 30 seconds of my day. But I think because I suppose I attempt to occasionally slow down, like get out of my kind of like blinkers, I guess, which I spend probably about 23 and a half hours of my day in, occasionally when we can move outside of that, these little interactions can make a really big difference to our lives. So yeah, that is something that I would like to commit to doing more of for myself too.
And what a difference it might make to that individual if someone each day recognized and validated the work that they are doing. And there would have been a lot of easy reasons for you not to do that. Like, how is he going to respond? At the end of the day, you are still like a woman approaching an unknown man in the street. There's like, oh, is he going to think I'm just like whatever judgment that he might make about why it is that you might be stopping to speak to him. So there are always reasons not to do it. There are always reasons not to, and some of them are like more real than others. But I really appreciate particularly that you said like you kind of walked past and then thought better of it and thought, no, because it's not neutral to just walk past someone doing something that is in service of us all without acknowledging them. And we've convinced ourselves that like that is neutral and normal, and it's actually not. So I love that you've shared this.
It was just reminding me that a couple of years ago, I was at a festival and I saw somebody who I had met 15 years ago at the start of my kind of spiritual wellness journey, who I'd met on a meditation retreat, who said something to me on the retreat that was so impactful that it was really life-changing for me. I said to my husband, I was like, I have to go across and say something to him. And I spent about half an hour rehearsing in my head what I was going to say, thinking he probably won't remember. He'll probably think that I'm weird. Oh, this is really awkward. Like, what if this goes really badly? And it took me about half an hour to like will myself to go up to him. We had a lovely interaction, and I came away from him and said to my husband, I'm going to practice acknowledging people or thanking people when that feeling comes up and just saying the thing. And I really put that in as an intention into practice. And like at protests that I've been to where I've met people who like, I might have seen them sharing online and I really respect their work, or people that I've gone, to an event and there's a certain person there that I really want to speak to. I've really practiced just going up to somebody and like saying the thing. And a few months ago, I saw a creator at a protest whose work I love, and I like stormed up to him and was just like, oh my God, I literally love you. And my friend that I was, and it was a really like fun conversation. And my friend was like, you're so shameless at this stuff. You just go up to anyone. And I said to her, I was like, I'm so pleased that you have said that, because actually 2 years ago, that would have terrified me, having that type of interaction. And I really just wanted to throw this in kind of as we end, because it's just reminding me within myself that these skills can be learned and they can be practiced, that we can develop these abilities to have these little but big changes in the ways that we relate to strangers and in our intimate relationships and with ourselves. And that is a process.
I love it, Megan. And it's so funny because this week I was at an outdoor pub situation watching England get knocked out of the World Cup with my husband and children and some friends. And a woman came up to me and she was like, Keri. I was like, yeah. And she was like, you taught me hypnobirthing 10 years ago. I had an amazing birth. I rang you from the hospital and you gave me some advice. Come and meet my daughter. I was so moved, actually. I was like really deeply moved by being remembered in that way. And obviously having like affected someone's life in a kind of key threshold moment of their life. And yeah, so I think all of us ought to be going out of our way to like spread that kind of loving regard at any chance we get.
I love that. Right. After this call, I'm going out into the street. And if I see you, I'm going to be like, you are special. You are special. Okay. Right. We need to wind up because I've had enough of your, I was going to say, I've had enough of your time. No, I've never had enough of your time, but I've taken up enough of your time. Keri, you are doing a course on all of these topics in September. So for anybody who's interested in continuing this work, I'd love for you to introduce what that is.
So I have this thing happening. It's called Hard Relate, Learning to Stay in Service of Life. And the intention is for us to learn and practice some relational skills together. It comes on the back of a course that I ran 2 years ago called Live Your Feminist Life in Integrity, but Make It Not Destroy All Your Relationships. And not only did I want to find a more elegant title, but I also realized that I didn't want to focus solely on conflict. I didn't want to be like, hey, everyone, come and spend your time and your energy thinking about conflict all the time. I realized not just that that's not an easy sell, but it's also not something that is easy to stay with. And over the last couple of years, I feel that I have learned an awful lot about how conflict sits within a wider relational sort of landscape, really. And how if we can broaden our focus on deepening intimacy in non-conflict situations, and then that supports us to feel more resourced when confrontation or disagreement does occur. So that will be on the portal where all of my digital offerings are, which is a digital learning neighborhood, which is a genuine alternative to tech oligarchy shenanigans run by Sally Burns and all who believe in it, and full of people who believe that this cannot be all there is. So whether you are interested in working with me or not, please go and get yourself a free experiencer account on the portal and come and get involved over there.
Yeah, fantastic. And all of your other offerings, which I endorse wholeheartedly, composting being one of them, all available on your website, right?
Yeah, just go to kerijarvis.com. Keri is Keri, and have a poke around there.
Fantastic. And I strongly recommend your newsletter as well. You send that out every Sunday, and that is an absolute joy. So thank you so much, Keri. Is there anything else that you wanted to add in today as we come to an end?
No, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for coming back. We'll have to do a third episode at some point because I enjoy recording with you so much. And thank you so much for all of the work that you do. You are a wise, wise woman, and I feel so grateful to have you in my neighborhood. So thank you for being you, and I hope that everyone enjoyed the conversation. Thank you for listening. It's great to have you with me on this journey towards higher love for all. Our time is our greatest commodity and gift, so thanks for investing it in yourself and sharing it with me. Please do take a moment to rate and review the show, all of which enables more people to find me and for me to connect with more great guests each week for both yours and my enjoyment. All links, references and contact information is detailed too within the show notes. And I always love to hear your feedback, so feel free to hit me up on my Instagram at higherlove_with_Megan or via my website higher-love.com. Send your takeaways, and if you enjoyed this episode, please share or send on to someone else who would benefit. Until next time, big love.